Hello everyone! The title of today's video is Advanced Options with Field Parameters and New Slicers, Groups, Descriptions and Tooltips. With today's example, we will address a common need, showing multiple types of metrics or calculations, say in a matrix visual, while still giving the users the freedom to choose which ones they want to see. We also want to show a description with each metric to make selection easier, and we would like to group the measures as well. What's important is that this solution should allow selecting metrics from different groups at the same time. Here you can see my solution in PowerBI. I can choose from the groups, select multiple at once, and only the metrics relevant to those groups appear. The selection doesn't influence what calculations are shown in the matrix visual itself, only when I actually click on them. And whenever I hover over a metric, a description immediately appears as a tooltip, helping business users to understand these measures. I will now walk you through the solution step by step. For the demo, I created a simple data model with two fact tables, sales and purchases, and a few very basic calculations. Most of the metrics you will see here are straightforward and commonly used. I created the field parameter table the traditional way, modeling new parameter fields from the menu. From there, I can choose the measures and generate the table. If you look at the code, nothing surprising is the standard. Technically, I could already build groups with modifying this code, but in my experience, that is not the best long-term solution, especially once you start adding more measures later. Instead, I created calculated columns in the table. In today's example, I grouped the metrics using switch function. But the grouping information could also come from an external data source. The descriptions were also loaded from an external source into a description column, first into a separate table, then pulled in using the lookup value docs function. Alternatively, we could use descriptions already stored in the data model for measures, something I will show later. In addition, I had to create a separate table with the distinct values of the group column. The code is simple, but it's important that this table should not be connected to any other table in the model. This is what we will use for group selection, the slicer you saw on the left side. Now let's look at the additional measures we need. First, KPI desk effects. This is responsible for the tooltip descriptions. If you are only interested in the tooltip part and not the grouping, this is all you need. Second measure, group selected. This filters the KPI selector elements based on the group slicer. Pay attention to the difference here. Sometimes we reference the group column in the KPI table, other times the group column in the KPI group table. This measure simply checks whether the group of the current KPI from the KPI table is among the groups selected in the KPI group slicer and returns 1 if it is, otherwise 0. Next one is DT KPI for dynamic title. This controls the title of the KPI selector slicer. It covers 3 scenarios, whether a single group, multiple groups, or all groups are selected. Selected KPIs. This is used to control colors in the group slicer. Right now, it's prepared to use inside a rule, but you could also implement it with a field value approach if you prefer measures to return the actual colors. You just have to adjust the measure a little bit. And the last is count KPI display. This counts all KPIs in a group and how many are currently selected. It gives users visual feedback. For example, you might see sales value 2 from 4, meaning that group has 4 KPIs total and 2 are selected. As you can see in the code, there are 2 versions under return statement, whether we want to show the total numbers for each group or only for selection. With all measures ready, let's return to the main page and check the slicer settings. The key to this whole solution is the new slicers introduced recently. They support tooltips, unlike classic slicers. For the group slicer, I used a list slicer. We select the group field from the disconnected table, and since new slicers let us disable the original values, we can replace them with any measure as the label. I used Count KPI display, which not only shows the categories, but also how many are selected. We also handle colors in a dynamic way with the selected KPIs measure. If any measure, for example from the purchase group, is selected, it gets a stronger color, meaning that something from that group is active. For the KPI selector on the right, I used a button slicer. We added the field and selected the KPI desk FX measure as a tooltip. Important settings here. Rename the measure title to a blank space. Disable single select, so you can add or remove items without holding Ctrl button on the keyboard. And in the properties, make sure tooltips are enabled. For a nicer look, I recommend a slightly transparent background color. To link the group slicer with the KPI selector, go to the filter pane of the KPI selector and add the group selected measure with the condition equals 1. This is needed for the behavior we want to achieve. Finally, we make the title dynamic depending on the selection. For this purpose, drag the dynamic title measure into the text option of the slicer title. Let's talk about the data sources for description. In this demo, I kept it simple. I used enter data to load descriptions into the descriptions table. But in the real environment where I build this solution, we use a data flow instead, since multiple reports share the same or very similar metrics. Storing everything in an external table is easier to maintain, which is why we choose that approach. Alternatively, you can also use measure or column descriptions already stored in the data model. Recently, a new feature was added that we can use. So I filled the description field for some measures in the model. Then I created a new calculated table called measures metadata with info.view.measures DAX function. What you can see now is already filtered and I selected the relevant columns. I can show you the original result for the function itself with all information coming from the data model. Let's change it back to the filtered version. From this point, I can use a very similar logic with lookup value DAX function to reference measure descriptions to field parameter table. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you have feedback, suggestions, opinions, or new ideas, please leave a comment. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and share it so other Power BI users and developers can find it too.